complex question is a question that includes assumptions, and if those assumptions are false, the complex question fallacy, aka the fallacy of many questions, is committed. Consider the question, who is the king of Sweden? This question assumes that Sweden has a king. That's not fallacious because it does, but asking who is the king of France is fallacious because the assumption that France has a king is false. Fallacious complex questions can be used to artificially restrict what answers can be given to ones that favor the position of the one asking the question, but they can also be used to give the audience false ideas without actually having to make false claims. By asking who is the king of France, I might get someone to believe that France is a monarchy without actually saying that it is. A special case of the complex question fallacy is the loaded question, which serves as a rhetorical trap designed to make your opponent say something they don't actually mean, typically something embarrassing or incriminating. I want my opponent to admit to having beaten his wife, so I ask him, "Have you stopped beating your wife?" Never having started beating his wife, he says no, which I can then twist into an admission that he is still beating his wife. As much as I despise the answers politicians often give in response to perfectly reasonable questions, reporters far too often ask them loaded questions. A well-known example is when Leslie Stahl asked Madeleine Albright, then US ambassador to the UN, if 500,000 children dying in Iraq due to UN sanctions was worth it. This is a yes or no question, and both answers would make Albright, the US, and the UN look bad. That makes it loaded. The question also assumes that 500,000 Iraqi kids had actually died and that their deaths were due to the sanctions. The first of these assumptions was questionable at best, since that figure came from studies that got their information from the Iraqi authorities, i.e. Saddam Hussein's regime. The second ignores the fact that exceptions were made for medicine, essential food, and other forms of humanitarian aid. As such, any deaths due to the absence of these would have been caused by the regime withholding them from the people, not by the UN withholding them from Iraq, because it didn't. Albright didn't challenge the assumptions, but rather stated that yes, it was worth it, basically telling the world that the US and the UN are fine with killing children. She later stated that she wished she had challenged the question. Atheists are often asked this loaded question by theists. If God doesn't exist, who created the universe? What they should be asking is, if God doesn't exist, how do you explain the existence of the universe? Of course, this question is still not the argument for God's existence that the theist probably thinks it is. Failure to provide an alternative explanation does not constitute evidence in support of the one proposed. That's an argument from ignorance, but at least it's no longer a loaded question. When phrased, who created the universe, the question includes the assumption that a personal being, a who, is responsible. What do we call a personal being that created the universe? A god, right? So essentially, the theist is asking the atheist, if the God I believe in doesn't exist, which one does? To answer the question as asked, the atheist has to acknowledge that at least one God exists, but that's obviously not what he believes. Among the theists asking this question, or at least a very similar one, we find, can you guess? Winston Wu. Quote, "One thing the atheists can never explain is who set up the vastly improbable default conditions for life to evolve in the first place." Unquote. The defense against this tactic should be obvious. Don't answer the question as it is phrased. Instead, challenge the assumption and rephrase the question, or preferably, ask the opponent to do so. Unfortunately, this can lead to accusations of dodging the question, and this is another application of complex questions, loaded or otherwise. They can force the opponent to provide answers that the audience will perceive as dishonest, since they are not answers to the question that was actually asked. Sorry, but in those cases the audience is simply wrong. The one being dishonest is the one asking the fallacious question. Until next time, stay logical.